All right, boundaries. I'm bringing this up again because I know I always express how important it is to set boundaries just to protect your own well-being, but I came to a realization recently that many people, and myself included, actually don't really know how to set boundaries. At least not in the most beneficial way. I was actually one of those that I thought I was setting boundaries correctly. I thought that I was doing what I needed to do, and then I had this realization the other day when a situation kind of came up that forced me to have to set boundaries. And in doing that, I kind of realized that I wasn't actually doing it in the most beneficial way. I thought I was. The intention was there to be doing it, the way that I was hoping to do it, but it just wasn't. I wasn't doing it that way. It was kind of, I was misleading the other person in the way that I was setting the boundaries. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So like we know, boundaries are super important, right? But sometimes I don't think we really understand how or why we actually use them. So like I was saying, I see and hear people, and myself included, I have seen and heard other people attempting to set boundaries, but what they're really doing is trying to initiate some sort of control over someone else. Boundaries should be set in a way to protect your well-being, by taking control over your life, not by taking control over someone else's. Boundaries are made for you. They're not made for someone else. So they're to protect your well-being by taking control over areas of your life, not by taking control over someone else's. And that's where I was sometimes falling up short, especially when it was something that, like a situation that was a little bit more of a difficult boundary to enforce. So an example, this is not the example that happened in my life, but I'm just using this because I think it's an example that most people can probably relate to. So let's just pretend that you have a super close friend. This is like your best friend in the world, and they have a drug addiction. And maybe you have, gone through all your healing, everything you need to do to become sober, and you're now a sober person, but your best friend is still, an addict. So being around your friend when they're high is just way too painful. It's too uncomfortable for you to watch. So you decide that you're going to cut all ties to your friend. You decide that you're no longer going to talk to them, you're not going to visit them, you're not going to accept any visits from them, you're going to completely cut them off. You're just not going to associate with them at all as long as they're still using. And you tell your friend this. Now, here's my question. Do you think that what you just did, what you just decided to do by cutting ties with your friend, is setting a boundary to protect your well-being by taking control of your life? So if you think that yes, that's what you did, then you need to keep listening to this message. What you actually did when you decided that seeing your friend on drugs and seeing them actually high was what bothered you, you made that realization, which is super great. That's awesome, because you need to do that first before you can actually move on to creating a boundary. But next you made that decision to stop talking, to stop visiting them, to just completely stop associating with them completely, until they had stopped using those drugs entirely. But now stop and think about that for a minute. Okay, if seeing your friend high is what bothers you, then why do you need to cut all ties with them entirely? Couldn't you just maybe establish a boundary that was in association with that case of just seeing them high. So when that scenario came up, you had a boundary set for just when they're high rather than cutting them off entirely. So when you decide to cut all ties, where you're no longer talking to them, you're not visiting, you're not associating with them at all until they stop using, what you're actually doing is trying to gain control over their life and force them to make a change that you want them to make to protect your well-being. You see where there's a difference there? Most likely, by doing that, the change, literally, even if it is beneficial to them, it's completely useless unless they're ready to step up and make that change. So boundaries are for you. They're control over your part of life and your part in the situation. They're not supposed to be out there to control somebody else's situation. And most likely, by trying to establish this boundary control and cutting those ties, it didn't work. It probably caused an argument. Your friend probably felt like they needed to defend themselves or possibly even defend their addiction, make up excuses, justify their behavior, whatever. They probably felt like you were turning their back on them and that now they weren't going to have anyone, even if they wanted to get sober in the first place. There wasn't going to be anybody there in their corner. So, they figure they have no support either way now, so what's the point? You probably got angry that they were making excuses and that they were trying to justify their behavior and defend their addiction, and most likely the attempt went absolutely nowhere. You probably both walked away pissed off and hateful towards each other, resentful. Your well-being wasn't protected. In fact, now it's triggered. Now you feel angry. You're overrun with all these negative feelings and all these negative emotions surrounding this situation, and you're going to have days following where you're going to feel guilt for setting that boundary. This is where you might cave in that boundary that you established because you feel guilty about it in the first place, because the boundary you tried to establish wasn't done in a way that gave you control or the other person control. So it just caused friction. So now let's look at the scenario a little bit different. Let's do this with just a little change. So again, remember, it's the sight of seeing your friend high that's the trigger for you. So rather than cutting ties with your friend, just set a boundary that you will not talk or visit your friend when they are high. So when they're currently high, when you see them and they're all strung out, maybe they're passing out or their eyes are, huge or whatever. When you see them and they're actually high, that's when you create your boundary, because that's what's actually the trigger for you. That's the problem. It's not so much the fact that they're using. Of course, I'm sure that bothers you if you've decided to become sober yourself, but it's actually seeing them physically high that is the trigger for you. So that's where you set your boundary. So in doing that, you decide that you're just not going to talk or visit your friend when they're high. So regardless of whether they're using or not, you are just going to avoid them when they are actually high from the drugs themselves. You tell your friend this and you explain that if they visit or you visit them and they're high, you're simply just going to leave. Or you're going to tell them that they need to leave. If you talk to them and they're high, you're simply just going to end the conversation. In this case, your friend likely isn't going to feel like you turn your back on them. They're still going to feel like you are their friend, but they're also going to understand that you are setting these boundaries for yourself. You're not trying to control their life. You're just controlling yours in this situation. And you're controlling what you have control over. So they're going to understand that you're protecting your own well-being by avoiding contact when they're currently high in your presence, since that's the trigger and the initial reason for setting the boundary in the first place. Now, in some cases, you might have to cut all ties. Unfortunately, sometimes that's just the way it is. But the whole point of it is to recognize when you're taking control over your own life versus attempting to control someone else's life in order to protect your well-being. So just the slightest change to setting a boundary can actually determine the acceptance of it and the personal results of establishing it. So the next time that you set a boundary with someone, ask yourself if you're setting the boundary to protect your well-being, or if you're attempting to force the person to take on that responsibility for you. Are you taking control over that area of your life, or are you trying to take control over theirs? So my situation that happened was a little bit different. It didn't involve drug addiction, but it was kind of the same thing. I had somebody very close to me that I felt was just really making some bad decisions in their life. I did not feel like it was beneficial at all. And now I created a boundary for myself, which was basically just giving myself time, and not taking things personally from the other person. It was just giving myself some time. That was pretty much my boundary and all I needed, because I knew this person well enough to know that I wasn't going to be taking what they said or did personally, and blaming myself for that. I've healed enough to know how to do that, but I had family who struggled with that, and in creating a boundary, they had decided, well, I'm going to avoid this person completely as long as they keep making that decision. Like, I'm not going to have anything to do with them at all. I'm not going to talk to them. I'm not going to help them. I'm not going to, visit them. Nothing. Like, I'm going to cut all ties, or as much as possible. And, for that person, maybe they had to do that. I don't know. Maybe they did because they felt like they just didn't have any other way, or maybe it was just way too much of a trigger for them, and so that's what they had to do. But most likely they were doing that because they wanted the person to change, which actually, in fact, I do know that was kind of the driving force behind it. It wasn't that they were trying to set a boundary to protect themselves and their dislike for certain areas of the situation and certain parts of it. It was that they didn't like what the person was doing in general, and they wanted to completely make that person change. They almost wanted to put it out as you're either going to choose me or you're going to choose your decisions. Choose your bad decisions or choose me, but that's it. Those are your choices. And they kind of wanted them to pick and choose between that, and that's just not fair. And that's not going to, it's just 99% of the time that's not going to go in your favor. If the person is not actually holding themselves accountable and in that position of being to realize what decisions it is that they're making that's jeopardizing their own life, they're not going to listen to you when you tell them you have to choose between me or your bad decisions. They're going to choose their bad decisions because they feel like their bad decisions are their good decisions and what they should be doing, and then they feel like you're just attacking them. So instead of trying to actually take control and force somebody to change their behavior or change something that they're doing, because you don't like it, you need to just take control over the area that you can. Figure out what it is that actually triggers you about the situation or the person, and then set a boundary based on that, rather than trying to set a boundary on the whole picture. So hopefully that helped clear some stuff up about boundaries. And we'll talk to you next time on Raw Thoughts.